Will schools named after Confederate figures be renamed? We found more than a dozen schools in Florida are named after people who fought for the Confederacy, people who fought to keep Black Americans enslaved.
Mr. Corcoran, you're not going to answer our questions?
The Florida Education Commissioner didn't want to talk about it, but we found some people who did. Let's see what's brewing. I'm Jenna Bourne, and I'm an investigative reporter at 10 Tampa Bay. If you're new here, welcome to our caffeine-fueled, homemade deep dive into issues that matter to you. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. As part of the ongoing conversations this summer about systemic racism in America, there's been a lot of talk about whether Confederate statues should come down. The big question here is whether we should continue glorifying people who lost a war over slavery. The primary argument to keep those landmarks is that it's important to preserve history. But it's not just statues that honor Confederate figures. Schools do, too. We found more than a dozen Florida public schools named after Confederate figures, including two right here in Tampa Bay. One of these schools, J.J. Finley Elementary in Alachua County, says new name coming soon on its website. And these three schools with Lee in their names are in Lee County, a county named after Robert E. Lee by another Confederate general. At one of the governor's news events in Tampa, I asked Florida Education Commissioner Richard Corcoran if he'd talk on camera about whether it's time for schools named after Confederate figures to be renamed.
If you want to get me right after, it'd be better.
Right after?
Yeah.
Are you still going to be around?
Yeah, I'll be around.
But after I asked this question about his department during the news conference,
Governor, the Florida Department of Education is refusing to release its pandemic plan. We've been asking for 3 months. Don't you think the public has a right to know what was in the plan?
he left out a side door instead.
He's walking out. Mr. Corcoran, why don't you want to answer our questions about schools named after Confederate figures? You have not answered all my questions, sir.
I answer all your questions. Every single time I always answer your question.
Then why are you driving away, sir?
Well, that was awkward. Anyway, the chair of the State Senate Committee on Education agreed to talk to me the next day.
There are more than a dozen schools in Florida that are named after Confederate figures. Do you think it's time for that to change?
I see that as a historical thing, and I think it affects, depending on your background and your perspective, it affects you differently. But those are really local decisions, and it's really a decision for those superintendents and those boards to make those decisions based on their community.
Which brings us back to our question. Will schools named after Confederate figures be renamed? Here in Florida, it sounds like any changes will be made on the local level, which is exactly what's happening right now in Jacksonville.
How did it feel going to a high school named after a Confederate general?
The fact that I went to a school that had been named after someone who, oppressed people like me for years was just really just enlightening, and it changed my view of a lot of things.
If Brandon Griggs looks familiar, it might be because he was also in our episode about whether Florida needs to rethink how it teaches Black history.
A petition popped up in our community to rename Robert E. Lee High School, and I actually rallied a bunch of students from Hear the Youth, which is the organization myself and my peers run. And so we all had a bunch of students sign that petition. And we work with other, local organizations to get people involved.
In June, the school board unanimously voted to explore changing the names of 6 Duval County schools named after Confederate figures. But it's not a sure thing. Here's how it's going to work. When classes start, each of those schools will involve students, alumni, staff, faculty, and the community in the process. They'll talk about whether to change the name, and if so, what the new name should be. The school board makes the final decision.
It made us feel like African American youth voices, do matter, and they can make a change. And it's just another form of activism, just like the people we learned about in African American history class.
Here in Tampa Bay, we identified 2 schools named after Confederate figures, both in Hillsborough County. The African American History Task Force has identified Hillsborough County Public Schools as an exemplary school district, and last month the district brought on board a new chief of equity and diversity. But it still has 2 schools named after people who fought in the Confederacy. Jackson Elementary, which was originally named Stonewall Jackson Elementary after the famous Confederate general when it was built in the 1920s, and Lanier Elementary, built in 1959. This document, The History of Hillsborough County Public Schools, says the school was named after Sidney Lanier, a poet born in Georgia in 1842. What it doesn't mention is that he also fought in the Confederate Army and was captured as a prisoner of war. When it comes to renaming schools named after Confederate generals, Hillsborough County Public Schools has done it before. In 2018, the school board renamed Lee Elementary, which was named after Confederate General Robert E. Lee, after the school was destroyed in an electrical fire. It's now called Tampa Heights Elementary. So in Hillsborough County, will schools named after Confederate figures be renamed? For Jackson and Lanier elementary schools, there's no indication that's in the works. For the past month, we've been asking Hillsborough County Public Schools to talk to us about this story. Their spokesperson ultimately told me on the phone, right now is not the time. She says they're swamped with scrambling to reopen schools during a pandemic, and she's not aware of anyone local calling to rename those schools. She says she's open to setting up an interview after schools reopen, and we look forward to that interview.
Even if they keep the name, they need to learn the history that go along with it. And sometimes when you learn the real true history of something, you don't have to ask people whether they want to change. They'll demand change.
I do want to mention there are schools in our community that are named after Black historical figures, like Gibbs High School in St. Petersburg. It's named after Jonathan Gibbs, who served as Florida's Secretary of State and the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. If there's a topic you think What's Brewing should look into, send us a tip at turn10@10tampabay.com. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss an episode, and I'll see you next time.